All right, welcome to another episode of the Credder Podcast. I'm your host, Chase Palmieri, and with me today is Scott Nover, an emerging industries reporter at Quartz. That's QZ.com. He was previously covering social media at Adweek and has also written for The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Vox, and other major outlets. Scott, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so I've been following some of your work for a while. As you know, I'm in the space and I look to people covering social media and advertising and all these emerging platforms. So this is a space that I'm very passionate about. And I follow your work. I follow you on Twitter as well. I've been enjoying a lot of your posts and your articles. And so I figured it was time to invite you onto the podcast for a deeper discussion. And I thought we might as well kick things off with kind of the hot topic that everybody in this space covers probably disproportionately. And I'm going to be somewhat hypocritical here by bringing them up, which is Facebook. Would you agree that Facebook gets maybe more media coverage than it should as far as reporting and cable news coverage? Is it accurate to be covering it as much as it is because of the power or the position of the platform? What are your general thoughts on how much we report on Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's also something I've been thinking a lot about, just given the leaks and what the whistleblower and the consortium of news organizations has been doing, which is really good work this week and over the last month or so. I think the answer to your question is a little bit complicated. I think given unlimited resources for tech reporters, I think that Facebook is covered as much as it should be. I think it's the biggest social media company. Like about more than a third of the world, maybe close to half the world, is on a Facebook app, whether it's Facebook, WhatsApp, Messenger, Instagram, and it has disproportionate influence in the world, not just in the United States, but all across the world. It's a really, really big and important, massive company. I think it deserves a lot of coverage. That being said, I think there's an interesting dynamic here where I don't think that a lot of other social media companies are covered as much as they should be, that are in the same space and have a ton of power as well. For example, Twitter. Well, Twitter is actually probably overcovered considering its user base, but that's a separate matter. Snapchat, Pinterest has a massive user base, is not really covered much. TikTok, we're seeing bits and spurts, but 1 billion users from its parent company, and so there's no perfect balance, but I think it does beg the question. Is Facebook overcovered? I don't know, but I think some of the other big players that could challenge Facebook or are just really important big companies in the space are undercovered, probably because Facebook is this behemoth.
Yeah, okay, that's totally fair. And what I think is it kind of plays into the similar aspect where we see regulators and politicians disproportionately talk about Facebook and the harms of Facebook. On some level, it's just become kind of a low-hanging fruit whipping post for politicians and reporters and anybody that just kind of wants to get content out there. But of course, agreed that the reach and the power of that platform is meaningful and worth paying attention to. But I see, I've seen your Twitter posts and other people that you're talking to on Twitter, and it seems like reporters are starting to get sick of having to cover Facebook as much as they do.
Oh, I mean, I wish I never had to, but I just don't think most things are that, it presents interesting regulatory questions at this point. I don't think the content of the platform is ever that interesting in like a positive way. And so it kind of translates to a lot of negative stories. I think you alluded to something before, which is regulator attention. And I think that's behind a lot of this and why a lot of reporters are covering it so disproportionately. And this is just really overdue regulatory attention, in my opinion. For a long time, Facebook and other social media companies just never really were on the radar of regulators and lawmakers, who also just didn't really understand what big tech companies were doing in Silicon Valley and what Facebook really was, and they didn't really use Facebook, or they still don't really use Facebook, or it didn't matter till their campaigns until more recently. So I think a lot of the regulatory conversations that are happening right now in Washington are pretty overdue and kind of maybe stale. Maybe not stale, but these are conversations that lawmakers and regulators probably should have been having 5-6 years ago. And so it's kind of like living in the past, watching all of these things happen. But, I guess that then you're like, when is Snapchat coming to Snapchat and TikTok and YouTube are in Congress right now. And that's, I was unable to tune into that for the most part today, but I can't imagine if they barely understand Facebook, how they're going to understand TikTok. So, I think there's a lot of weird dynamics, but just to go back to that, I think journalists are following, for the most part, a lot of this regulatory pressure or impacting the regulatory focus right now.
Yeah, and I think that that's fair, because a lot of if there is a regulatory change targeted towards social media or kind of these user-generated content platforms, it really will affect the internet as a whole. And Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg in particular says, please regulate us, please. We don't want to have to make these decisions. Companies shouldn't have to make these decisions. We encourage regulation. And, on some level, maybe there's, honesty in that maybe these are difficult decisions to have to make, and they want to comply with Section 230 and remain kind of this distributor and platform and agnostic kind of content provider and not an editorial or publisher. But at the same time, if we do see regulation that is not done properly, which personally I'm skeptical that we will see high quality regulation, just because of what you're talking about, that a lot of these people don't seem to understand how Facebook works at all. So it's hard for me to believe that they're going to regulate it properly. It could actually create a situation where Facebook is at a further advantage because they have the legal team to kind of comply with whatever the new regulation is, whereas these smaller social media startups might actually be kind of forced into a business model that they can't really get off the ground with. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that is both a common talking point from Facebook and other big tech companies, and also I think it's true. I think it's right. Which I don't say about most Facebook talking points. I am skeptical that we're going to have smart liability reform, platform liability reform in this country that is going to be helpful and solve the problems that lawmakers are concerned about. And I think that, I think that is totally possible, that Facebook being hit with a ton of lawsuits, which is what a repeal of Section 230 would mean, is going to really, really, really hurt Facebook. And I do think it will make it harder for American companies or social media companies that are starting out in America, to get big. And so I think that it would either further divide the top flight of companies from newcomers, but it also could it also could just mean that companies are going to get big in China and then expand it, once they have resources, then expand into the United States or a different market. We could see something like that. I think there is some truth to that statement. I think it is also a scare tactic, though. And I think the Facebook "please regulate us" is disingenuous because every company wants regulation that works for them. Facebook has one of the most robust lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C. They're not, willy-nilly, anything that works for you, just hit us with. They could be really, really screwed by regulation. Not just on 230, but antitrust and other matters, privacy. And I think that it is both true and kind of also a scare tactic at the same time.
Yeah, and we'll stick with Facebook for just a little bit longer because there's so many other more interesting topics to cover here in the changing media landscape. So it seems like about once a year, Facebook runs into some PR nightmare, whether it's Cambridge Analytica in the past or complaints of Russian meddling in the elections. It seems like every year something comes out and Facebook gets dragged again and more increased regulatory pressure and again, all the reporters, tech reporters, platform reporters, advertising reporters come out and start writing about Facebook. How important is this whistleblower complaint? Because personally, it feels like it's just showing us that Facebook also knew what everybody already knew.
I don't know. I think that what you're saying is that every year there's something really bad and nothing really bad happens to Facebook. And I think that's right. Last year, I was at Adweek, which is advertising trade publication, and I was covering the advertising boycott of Facebook, which was at the time a really big deal. A bunch of over 1,000 advertisers, including a bunch of really big names, stopped advertising on Facebook for a month or a month plus. And it quickly became, in protest of how Facebook handled the Black Lives Matter protests of the summer and hate speech in general. And it just was another thing that Facebook overcame and didn't really dent their earnings or their performance. They just had such a chokehold on small business advertisers. It just didn't really matter what Procter and Gamble did, to be honest. So it revealed a lot more about Facebook's core business than anything else. They're not really, they don't really have a ton of competition, and they don't have a ton of and pressure from advertisers isn't, or civil rights groups doesn't do that much. And so I think what we're seeing with the whistleblower is they did take a big dent in their stock, but it's hard to say that is correlated necessarily with the whistleblower. It could be more about Apple's IDFA privacy changes. And I was listening to the earnings call yesterday, and I wrote about this for Quartz, but not a single analyst on Wall Street asked anything about the Facebook files whistleblower leaks at all. Wall Street doesn't really seem to be concerned about what Facebook is doing ethically or societally, and doesn't really care that about what the whistleblower is saying. So I don't know. It could definitely be different. It could also not be. I don't really know, but I don't think it's going to destroy Facebook's stock price unless it really spurs some sort of regulatory action that I am unaware of right now. And I even then I don't know.
Okay, and I have a bit of a hot take on something you just brought up, actually.
Go
This,
for it.
and I'd love to hear you tear it apart if it's not, if there's no basis to it. But you called out kind of this advertiser protest, block ban, whatever you want to call it, when all these advertisers kind of simultaneously decided that they were going to stop. Mostly, most of them, I think, just temporarily. I'd say most of them are advertising on Facebook again, but temporarily stop advertising on Facebook. When I saw this happen, I was very skeptical. I thought that this was a little bit disingenuous because it happened at a time when a lot of these companies were starting to get concerned about the coronavirus pandemic. And a lot of them were making cuts, not just to their advertising budgets, but to employees, to benefits, a lot of things. A lot of these companies were tightening their belts. And to me, it felt like they were all just kind of temporarily halting their advertising because they either knew they were going to have supply issues and couldn't, supply the physical products or services anyway, or they just wanted to tighten their belts and wither and ride through the pandemic to see, cooler waters before they ramped up their marketing again. And it felt to me like they had to explain to their investors why they were going to kind of slow down the growth, slow down that paid user acquisition. And they didn't really want to say, oh, because we're going to have supply chain problems, or, oh, because we're worried that, this might cause to a recession or depression. it felt to me like a very convenient excuse to say, oh, because of Black Lives Matter and Facebook advertising policies. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's also what month was it? It was July.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, I think the slowest or second slowest month for advertise. I mean, if they were going to do this in November, then it would be a different story when
Right.
everyone's buying, Christmas presents. I don't. Yeah, I think you're right. I think that companies are generally motivated by image and PR and what's convenient for them. And I think there's a lot of pressure to take a stand against Facebook. Maybe that's good, maybe that's not. That's not for me to say whether that's whether boycotts work or they're effective or whatever. But I don't think that for the most part, many of these were a big sacrifice, and I think that I'm sure there's a few here and there, but I also didn't see, a big D2C brand stop, being on Instagram, right? If I saw Allbirds not advertise on Instagram or be on Instagram and figure out how to completely revamp their business, then, maybe, but yeah, I think you're right to call bullshit on it. And we did some reporting about how quickly people came back, what they were saying, and when they came back, and they all came back, I think. And
Yeah.
that's also happened. It's not just Facebook. That happened with YouTube a few years ago, if you remember. They had a big ad boycott for a lot of the same reasons, and everyone came back because it's YouTube.
Yeah. At the end of the day, platforms like YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, we might not be happy about the level of control they have over kind of small business economics and how all of these businesses online attract customers, but this is the reach. This is where people spend their time and their attention, and therefore they're going to have a competitive advantage at attracting advertisers, no matter what their kind of policy choices are.
Yeah, and I mean, Facebook has been revolutionary for small businesses that want to promote themselves. I mean, it's probably the cheapest and most effective advertising you can buy if you are a small business. You have great targeting capabilities in terms of actually getting results. I mean, there's a reason that they, are what they are. And they're really important for political campaigns. They're really important for brands that don't want to be on Amazon or something like. There's a lot of ways that Facebook provides a really invaluable advertising service. And I think that the other thing was Facebook wasn't ever really about Procter and Gamble or these Patagonia or these big companies. It's about mom and pop shops.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And very last question on Facebook, because I really do want to move on.
I know. Is this the hypocrisy? This
Yeah,
is
this is the
this is the
hypocrisy
disproportionate.
section.
I mean, it's a fascinating company. We need to think hard about Facebook,
Yeah,
and I think that there's a long time in tech reporting and in Washington and lots of things that Facebook wasn't thought about critically. So we'll make up for it in this podcast.
Yeah, at the end of the day, they are kind of the tip of the spear or the canary in the coal mine, however you want to put it. I mean,
one of those.
They're leading the way into new directions that are worth, analyzing deeply. So last one here is, maybe I'll get a little bit of speculation out of you, has to do with Facebook's Metaverse rebrand. So this might be challenging because I'm not sure I would do a good job of explaining it, but could you maybe explain what the Metaverse is and then what you're expecting out of this rebrand?
So the Metaverse comes from a sci-fi book from the 90s. And basically that vision is one giant corporation that controlled this really immersive digital space. Think kind of like, put on a virtual reality set and you're in it. What Mark Zuckerberg and a lot of other people in Silicon Valley are talking about is kind of the next generation internet. And it's something it doesn't really exist right now, but basically imagine an internet that you can step into that has a virtual reality kind of component to it. It's immersive. It connects lots of different things, like the internet connects different websites. And you can go from place to place and really feel like you're there and you're connected. There's 1.5 million challenges to actually achieving that. Mark Zuckerberg is one person who has devoted a lot of his is putting a lot of chips into saying that he wants to help build the metaverse. Whether that's whether that's secretly a Facebook product or not is another thing. But he says altruistically that he wants to help construct the next version of the internet and as a kind of a public good. And so I guess we'll see what he means by that. Yeah. Facebook has a lot of virtual reality investments as well because they own Oculus, the VR device.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what that rebrand is. I saw a couple funny memes that were like, Facebook's going to change its name so that regulators can't find them or something like that. All right, enough of Facebook. Let's move on to some more interesting trends. So I want to talk a little bit about the lab leak theory, and I'm not going to push you to, make any kind of scientific claims. I just want to talk about how the reporting around this topic kind of happened and how it's been changing over time. So at the very beginning of the pandemic, the thought of the lab leak theory from the Wuhan lab was seemingly not even tolerated by many in media. It was talked about as a far-off conspiracy theory, and in some cases even positioned as a racist thought to think that it might have actually escaped from the lab. Now, I don't think we will ever know for sure whether it was even necessarily escaped in Wuhan itself, whether that was really the first location or somewhere else, or if it was from these wet markets in China or the lab. But it was a little bit over the top how we as consumers were encouraged to not even consider that as an avenue of how it might have come out. And then now with more reporting and kind of more time and more voices that are willing to kind of put themselves out there, it seems like it might be becoming a more acceptable version of what could have played out. Why was the media responding that way? Is it that China itself has so much PR power and control over American media that they were pushing people to protect their image? Is it that this concept is somehow racist to think that it might have leaked out of the lab, even unintentionally? What was with this big push to tell us not to think about this?
I really do not know, and I apologize. I think that there is a lot of difficulty in terms of kind of balancing the reporting on like official guidance and what the going theories are about something as sensitive as the pandemic, and kind of like trusting authorities and things like that, but also evolving with their guidances as they evolve, that journalists have really struggled with. I think about the beginning of when the pandemic first hit the United States, and everyone was kind of washing their hands compulsively and not wearing masks, and how the CDC guidelines were changing about that and said, don't wear a mask, right? And so I think that there's a temptation to come down really hard on kind of the version of a truth that is apparent at the moment. And I think there's good intentions behind that. But also I think it can erode trust when guidance changes, or common understanding changes, or more reporting reveals something. I am not as learned up on the lab leak hypothesis, though I do understand that it has kind of changed from what it was once cast as. And I think that the racist kind of elements of it are somewhat valid, but also, at the end of the day, we're all just trying to figure out what happened, where this virus came from. And so I think there's a temptation, certainly from journalists to kind of come down hard on misinformation as it seems um, in real time, but facts do evolve, and our understanding of the situations evolve, and I think that kind of trigger reaction is not always as helpful as it might seem, even if it is such a kind of um, important and important topic as COVID, and one that really can affect a lot of people's lives.
Yeah. Okay. Then I won't go too much deeper on that. Then we'll bring it back to kind of the advertising and social media world. Um, you I'm sure remember the Hunter Biden laptop story that was pretty big right into the lead up of the election there. And Twitter, and I also believe Facebook, but I think Twitter was the first to actually pull the article off of its platform. They have their stated reasons for doing so because they think that the information might have been obtained illegally through hacks or something like that. Um, but at the end of the day, it's a platform that decided to pull down a publisher's article and selectively do so, which you could consider an editorial decision from Twitter. Um, what do you make of that? Because these platforms, they tend to position themselves or brand themselves as free and open and agnostic, but then they do make the occasional editorial decision. Um, and they're really not supposed to, but they're also encouraged to do so by the media and certain users and regulators to do so. So they're kind of stuck in this lose-lose scenario where if bad content is left up on their platform, they get in trouble. If they pull certain content off the platform, they're called out as censors and they get in trouble. Where do you think these platforms, like, what can they do? Is there a solution here? Should they leave all content up and just provide more context labels, third-party ratings? What do you think is the solution here long term?
Yeah, and remind me, I think Twitter did apologize and reverse its decision. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it took them about a month, but they also, I think, temporarily banned the New York Post.
Yeah, I think that's extreme. I think yeah, I've put that period of time out of my memory, luckily, because God knows I don't want to be back in November 2020 or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think that you bring up a really interesting question about editorial discretion. There's a long history of journalists and other people kind of telling Facebook and Twitter and other social media companies that, hey, you're a media company, you host media, you make decisions, please acknowledge that. And we're not always happy with what those decisions are, but I think it's really important to see Twitter as a media company with editorial decisions. Everything they do is an editorial decision, whether it's just append kind of whether it's enforcing their rules, which they've made up, or appending labels to Trump's tweets, or kicking Trump off, or removing certain ones of his tweets, or verifying certain news organizations or individuals, or just how their algorithm works. I think it's all a series of editorial decisions. They are curating a really important information environment, and that needs to be seen as a media company doing just that. And I think that as news organizations get things wrong, and we make corrections and we make public statements and we try to be transparent about that. Twitter and other social media companies should be as well. But I don't think we should. I do think it was extreme to remove, like overrule the New York Post, though their track record isn't fantastic. It's not Bloomberg Business Week over here. But I think we should, and I think it was wrong of them to just like remove the New York Post entirely or whatever they did, or block links. I thought that was, I think that's a little counter to like their commitment to free, open discussion and open, an open platform. But I think that we should expect them and to make editorial decisions and to figure out what their editorial voice is, and hold them to that. And if that's not something that we as consumers like, we have the opportunity to go elsewhere. There's a lot of social media companies. You do not have to be on Twitter. And I think like people think that they have a right to be on Twitter and that Twitter owes them some sort of free and open discussion. They really don't. If that's what their consumers want, they'll tell them, but you don't have to be there. And it controls a lot of speech, but it doesn't, there are other ways to speak. Twitter does not own a monopoly on your speech.
Yeah. And so now I'm going to kind of throw a few different things at you. So I want to cover shadow banning just as a concept, because I think a lot of people that aren't in the space don't even necessarily know that what shadow banning is, or that it might be happening to them, and kind of why a platform would make that decision. So I want to talk about shadow banning. Then I'd like to talk about this concept of the consumer being able to choose their own algorithm. So like maybe when we go to Twitter in the future, we'll be able to select different algorithms out of a basket to kind of personalize our feeds a little bit more. And then I'd like to cover decentralized social networks in general. Like, is this the future? Are there going to be new incentive mechanisms that eventually allow them to overpower the network effects of these existing players? So let's start with shadow banning. It's basically the idea that the platform, we'll just stick with Twitter as an example, can kind of limit the reach of your posts without you realizing that they're throttling the reach of your posts. This makes sense from the platform's perspective, definitely, because they get to control, as they should, the reach of content, but they're doing it in a way where you, the consumer, can't really provably get upset with them because you can't really see or know or definitively say that you're being shadow banned. So just thoughts on shadow banning as a tool in their toolkit.
Yeah, I haven't reported on this specifically. My gut says that 99% of the time that someone thinks they're shadow banned, they're just mad that their post didn't do very well on social media. And so you see a lot of that on, from conservatives on Twitter or people on TikTok. I see a lot of it on TikTok, and maybe that is a place where that is more legitimate. I think that social media companies should be transparent about what they do. If they action, as they say, and that's their term, if they action an account or a post or something like that, they should provide rationale for the most part. I think Instagram just started doing that, which I think is really great. And a way to appeal if that's something. But I don't know. I don't get the sense that Twitter is putting a bunch of people in the doghouse because of whatever reason. Maybe that is true. I guess I'm a little more open to that on TikTok. I see a lot of kind of confusion about how the algorithm there powers works, and people that are suddenly getting 1 million views on every video and then 400 for months and months and months, or their views don't correlate with their follower count or things like that. The mechanism at play on TikTok is a little bit more mysterious. I think there's something that's possibly true there. I don't see it as a prevailing reality. Again, I haven't really, dug into this, but I don't see this I see this more as conspiracy on a place like Twitter or Facebook. People kind of complaining that they're not doing well on the old posts. So yeah, I don't know.
Okay. And
What's your
what do you, I think it makes sense that it's happening. I think you're right. I think sometimes people claim that when their posts don't do as well as some other post, and maybe they have no idea why the previous post did so well and why this one didn't do well. But I have seen a lot of, especially on YouTube, a lot of kind of news commentators show their growth in revenue and growth in user base. And then when YouTube made some changes to tamper the reach of what they considered borderline content, which again is kind of they didn't really define. A lot of those smaller independent commentators were throttled, and they are not given transparent explanation for why. And I think that there's a deeper point here, which is that regulators and the media and users often talk about oh, be transparent about how your algorithm works. Be transparent about why certain things are showing up in my feed and not others. But I think there's a real reason why these platforms can't do that, and it's twofold. One is that the algorithm is always changing. They're always making small, minute optimizations to that algorithm. And the second is that if they were to actually disclose exactly how the algorithm works, you're basically just inviting spammers to come and ruin the platform because now they know exactly, what the content or posts need to do to fit in, and then you can go ahead and spam that platform. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and it's their business. If Google tells you how their algo how Google works, then that's really important business information.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are some important points about algorithmic transparency that smart people have made, but I think you touched on something else that's really interesting that I wouldn't call shadow banning, which is just changes in the algorithm and how they affect people, content creators or influencers, or people that are part of the so-called creator economy. Basically, after YouTube started sharing advertising revenue with people who made videos, that kind of sparked an entire generation of people to start making money online, which is a great thing. I think that we kind of make fun of that and influencers and people, sometimes because it can be a little silly, but that's fantastic. It's ushered in a ton of economic activity and entertainment, and a lot of people have made careers out of this. And when algorithms change, those people are disproportionately affected. I mean, that's livelihoods that are on the line. And I think those people, if not everyone, as kind of people who kind of work for or on that platform, whose livelihoods are dependent, deserve transparency. They deserve kind of some basic protections, or I think like Substack gives you like your email list. I think that's fantastic. You can take those emails and you can type them into Gmail. You can send your own emails if Substack stops working for you. You can take it to Ghost. You can do, I think there's an interoperability kind of thing that these companies need to work on. And we also saw it in the news industry when Facebook pivoted to video and then unpivoted to video, or pivoted away from video, and kind of how news organizations had become extremely dependent on Facebook for traffic. I think, Quartz, my news organization, which I was not at the time, was very much caught up in that. And then really burned when they stopped rewarding short form video content. These companies are so big that they have the power to change entire industries and to shift the way that people and companies make money. And I think that they, beyond a regulatory thing, they owe it to the people who depend on them, whether it's small businesses or content creators or aspiring content creators or news organizations, to be transparent about what they're doing. And if they're saying something like no more borderline content, define what that is, give some way that they can either leave the platform and retain some of their connection to their audience, and then also appeal if they feel like they've been wronged by it. And I think that there's some maturation that's necessary from these platforms if they want to keep being responsible actors in this creator economy that they've latched onto.
Yeah, and you kind of said it there, that the business is their algorithm. The algorithm is their business, especially because the algorithm determines how many ads we see and therefore exactly how much money they can make on an individual user basis. So on that note, do you think that consumers will ever be able to, quote unquote, choose their own algorithm, to go to Twitter or Facebook and say, I want the credible news algorithm, or I want the more puppies algorithm, or the less advertisements algorithm? Do you think we'll ever have a choice like that?
I think that would be great. I think the closest we're seeing to that is Twitter. I think what we're seeing is three things emerge from Twitter, if my understanding of where the company is moving is right. Currently, you have the algorithmic feed that you can choose from, or you can toggle between how Twitter used to be, which is just reverse chronological order. And that's great. That's more control than you have on, I think, any other platform. I can't think of, maybe I mean, Reddit, you can change between interfaces and, you know, some other things. But that's great from Twitter. And then they're providing you know, a subscription platform that they're testing. I don't know if this is something they're definitely going to go through with. And maybe that will give more options in terms of not seeing ads, or not seeing like a freemium model, or not seeing or changing how your algorithm looks. I think that's a good thing. I mean, ultimately, if you're concerned about engagement decreasing, which is exactly what all of these companies are concerned about, because that's how they make money. They serve ads against eyeballs. Why wouldn't you want to give? Why would you want to say, this is the experience that we're going to give you on Facebook or YouTube or TikTok? When a user will tell you what they want to see, and then use the product more. It sounds
But
like
the question though is, will they use the product more? Because a lot of people think they want something, but their time on site and their engagement actually says something else.
I mean, I'd love to see some A/B testing on that. I think that's fine. I think ultimately, what's the alternative? People are so addicted. I mean, I'm sure you feel it as well. I feel so addicted and so dependent on social media that I keep, you know, deleting the app, or I keep kind of struggling to, you know, setting limits or different things like that. And I think that and I think that the pandemic has kind of messed with some of that. But I do think that people will get to the end of the rope and really you know, feel like they need a more drastic kind of separation from social media apps if they are, you know, not using it in a healthy way. I think maybe that's the optimistic reading of that, but I think that more control is about how we use technology are also a good thing. But yeah, I mean, it's all margins and in advertising, and they'll do whatever they want to do, to whatever they need to do to make the most money.
Yeah. And I know that you follow somewhat what's going on with things like stablecoin and Bitcoin and the decentralized internet and blockchain. Do you think that there is room for basically the equivalent platforms, but built in a decentralized way, where the money ends up in the hands of the creators and the users? Do you think a decentralized Facebook or a decentralized Twitter stands a chance, a small chance? It's definitely the future. Do you have any opinions there?
I guess I'm not really sure what that entails. Do you have a vision for what that would look like?
So, okay. So for example,
Or does that look like the metaverse?
no, not the metaverse. Let's keep a kind of a simple product like Twitter. It could be that instead of the advertising revenue on Twitter going back to Twitter, you have a decentralized platform that maybe still has advertisers buying in, but then the money is distributed out to the most prolific content creators. And so that the people who are creating the content and creating the posts are getting the revenue, and therefore there's this built-in mechanism and incentive to keep posting content on that platform. And that maybe these incentive mechanisms would create a competitive advantage against a Twitter and a Facebook that will never relinquish their advertising revenue back to the users.
Kind of like I mean, I think of, when you say that, I think of like Wikipedia and kind of a nonprofit model. You know, imagine if Wikipedia was a paid product and the editors made money or something like that. I guess so. I mean, I think that that's possible. I think Ghost is another newsletter publisher that's either a nonprofit or some sort of collective or something like that, and they've been pretty successful and take less money from newsletter writers than Substack does. I'm not really sure. I think I would hope so. I hope that there is kind of a creator first social media platform that isn't just driven by economics. Or economics to a central company. I don't necessarily know that needs to be blockchain based, but I think that maybe something like a nonprofit or you know, could work. I think I have seen a blockchain-based blogging platform.
Yeah,
I'm
they
forgetting,
exist. Yeah.
yeah, I'm forgetting what that one's called, but that's cool. Yeah, I mean, I would love to see more innovation. I think that, and so Facebook can then copy that idea.
It's so funny you said that. That was my next question, was about the level of blatant copying of features that is happening across social media. You know, I mean, definitely Facebook set the trend with the way that they ripped off Spiegel, I believe, Evan Spiegel's
Yeah.
Facebook Snap features and things like stories. And then we see Twitter kind of adopting the Clubhouse feature into their application. Is this just part of for the course now? Like some new startup comes in, finds a revolutionary kind of new communication medium, and then the big guys just adopt it with a slightly different color and font, and it's all good?
Probably. I mean, Snapchat, I think, is a really interesting case study here. You have basically Mark Zuckerberg took the stories feature that Snapchat invented, which was an innovative new form of content on the internet. And they put it on Instagram, and Instagram did better with it. And it's on Facebook as well. And then Snapchat, instead of suing and raising a fuss, they compensated for it, and they said, go ahead, have it, whatever. We're going to build out the product in other ways. We're going to invest in original content and augmented reality and some other things, and still going to stick to our guns, what we do best, which is disappearing messages. So I think, and TikTok, to have the same thing. Facebook took the TikTok format, and they made Reels, which is on Instagram, and I think now Facebook as well. The difference there is that I don't think they've done as well with that, because there's something intrinsically missing there. TikTok as a community is just something altogether different and beyond kind of just the content format. And so I don't think they were as successful with that yet. I was listening to their earnings yesterday, Facebook's earnings, and they really are losing young users, and they're committed to really doubling down and investing in Reels and in that content format. So maybe we'll see some more in that. And then Twitter copying Clubhouse and social audio, and Snapchat, copied TikTok with their spotlight feature. There's a lot of cribbing. I think that's kind of par for the course in that space at this point, and it's not something that these companies are really suing over. And I think it's an interesting intellectual property question. I think beyond that, it's just all kind of boring. Like, if every company is offering the same exact thing, I think that's just kind of boring. And this Facebook is just completely not interested in innovating, its content formats or its platform, and they have to crib. I mean, that's fine. I think that, it is what it is. That's what incumbents do. I don't think that's good for the consumer necessarily, unless you really just want one app that does everything. And I think the companies that are doing really well are the ones that are still differentiating themselves. Snapchat is still differentiating itself. Twitter is still differentiating itself. Pinterest is still differentiating itself. TikTok. And that just becomes harder when everyone's copying each other. But, I don't expect that to really slow down. I just think it's kind of lazy.
Yeah. So last thing I'll say on that note is that we talk often about wanting there to be more competition in the social media space, and how do we limit the size and impact of a Facebook, for example. I think it's really easy. I don't know that we need to even get into regulation so much as this is two things that I think would drastically limit the power of Facebook. One is limit the amount of acquisitions they're allowed to make in the same space. So for example, in the future, I think we already know they wouldn't be able to make the equivalent Instagram acquisition going forward. There's just too many eyeballs on them now.
Yeah.
But that would have been a way to limit their growth. And you can imagine a world where Instagram stayed independent and already overtook Facebook by now. And then I think the other way is with these features, I think you can also imagine a world where even if Facebook had Instagram, if Snapchat comes up with that stories feature and is allowed to own it, then I can see a world where a lot of the Instagram users eventually make their way over to Snapchat. So I think that those are two ways that if we let that happen, if we kind of limited the acquisitions within the space and when a new company creates a feature, let them have some ownership or even just a temporary time period. Like, okay, Snap created the stories feature. They get a 1-year period where they're the only platform that gets to do this. Okay, fine. Then eventually it opens up. But I still think that would have drastically undercut the power that Facebook has today. And so next thing, last question before I get into kind of my wrap up questions that I ask every guest. This is just a question about some talk about PayPal possibly acquiring Pinterest. I don't know if you've been following this story. Sometimes these deals don't work out, but usually when there's as much kind of smoke as there is going on here, there probably will be a deal that comes through. And I think it makes sense. So I want to know what you think about PayPal acquiring Pinterest and this idea of incorporating the kind of purchasing and shopping behavior directly into social media browsing.
Yeah, I'll say before we start with that, I think yesterday PayPal came out and said they are not pursuing that
Oh, really?
deal. But I don't know. Maybe it'll happen, or maybe they'll acquire a similar company. I actually thought the deal made a lot of sense. I wrote about this on Friday before, kind of in between that period where it was reported and then knocked down. I think that Pinterest is a really important platform. It's a really popular platform, really broad user base, heavily female, and they're really leaning into kind of shopping experiences. The US has really lagged behind what's called social commerce, this idea of shopping on the internet, on social media, kind of scrolling and shopping in tandem. And that's something that China has done really, really well. And so I think that this deal made a lot of sense for both parties because Pinterest could have integrated with a payment provider, and then the payment provider, PayPal, is really trying to get bigger. They're trying to be I think a super app or whatever, some sort of phrase they said. And that really reminds me of what WeChat and Alipay, really WeChat is in China, this kind of singular app that everything happens: communication, shopping, commerce, payments, banking. And I don't know if there's room for that in the US market. I don't know if the consumer behavior is there. And I don't know if it's going to mimic what it is in China, but I think that and Facebook and Instagram have already kind of made a dent in the social commerce space, but I think that it's only going to expand that our social media experience that is so already heavily, commercial because of all the advertisers, brands, and influencers on the platform is just going to become something of a digital shopping mall, something where talking to your friends and buying things are one and the same and happen without really blinking. I think that behavior, if I had to bet, I don't make a lot of predictions, but if I had to bet, I would say that we're going to the social media companies are going to get a lot better at that. And I think users are going to get a lot more comfortable with transacting on a social media platform. So
would you say that Instagram is the best at that today?
Yeah, I think by volume, Facebook does more social commerce transactions. But I think that I don't really know if that includes their peer-to-peer marketplace, and I don't really know where that's based on an eMarketer study, but I'm not sure. I think in terms of like really, shopping from brands, that is really happening on Instagram mostly, and then also Facebook and Pinterest are kind of making a dent in it. TikTok is investing heavily in it. I think Twitter has even started talking about it, though they're probably behind. But yeah, I would say that Instagram is kind of probably custom built for that, or Pinterest, more so than others right now.
Yeah. Okay, well, I have two questions that I ask every guest that comes on the podcast. But before I get to those last two questions, why don't you give listeners, your Twitter handle, your personal website, anything that you want to basically drive users to, and I'll make sure to include those links in the show notes.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Scott Nover, Nover. You can find me on Twitter 24/7, unfortunately, because I have a problem. And you can find my work at Quartz, Quartz. And the website is qz.com. We are a business publication. I write about tech and other fun things on the internet. And yeah, find me on the internet.
And he's a great follow. All right, so last two questions for you here. First question is Bitcoin. Are you a believer? Is this going to be, are you a Bitcoin maximalist? What are your thoughts? Are you even informed on the space enough to give an opinion?
Yeah, I think with cryptocurrency in general, the real struggle is, how do we take it from what it is now as a speculative asset and actually use it? There aren't a ton of use cases for crypto. Bitcoin was meant to be bought, spent, and now it's really just being bought and sold like a stock. I think there are a lot of interesting use cases for cryptocurrencies, but right now the consumer demand is really for speculation, and the opportunity to get rich quick. And I don't know if that bubble needs to burst before it can be transactable currency. Certainly there needs to be regulation to protect consumers. But yeah, I don't feel that strongly about it. I think decentralized, commerce could be a decent idea, but how that actually works and how do we get to a point where we're spending cryptocurrency on average things, I just don't. I haven't seen that road yet.
Yeah. I agree that I think the initial kind of white paper positioned it as a peer-to-peer currency, and the people, I think it's fair to say that it's not necessarily the main use case today. But I do think that it's appropriate to also think of it as maybe a superior savings technology. Like you can take your cash dollars, put it in there, and at least, if you trust that there will be increasing demand over time, and if you trust that the protocol is what it is, and you've looked at the code, that at least it's not going to be debased by politicians or your local governments. So I think that there's a ton of interesting use cases. Some of them we're starting to see with like what El Salvador is doing. I don't know if you're following that at all. Making Bitcoin legal tender and using it to send American remittances into El Salvador without the transaction fees with Western Union. Anyway, it's something that I'm following very closely, and I ask every guest, and I think I'm going to have to keep asking every guest because I don't think it's going away.
I think it's fascinating. I think that there needs to be, it's tough because there is a lot of, it is intended as a kind of a entity that avoids institutions and government, but yet government regulation is coming for it. The SEC, the Fed is developing its own digital currency, whether that's blockchain based or not. I think that the space is about to get more regulated. I think that a certain amount is definitely needed just for consumer protection, because, I would not advise anyone to put their savings into crypto right now, or at least not, any substantial amount. But that being said, I think it's a fascinating space. I write a little bit about crypto and about NFTs and some other kind of weird facets of that. And I'm excited to see where it goes.
Yeah. All right. And very last question for you here today, Scott, is, are we living in a simulation?
Oh, wow. No, I do not think we're living in a simulation.
No? Very, very ready for that one. You've thought about this at least?
I've thought about it. I don't, even if we are, I don't feel like it's productive to give that much brain space personally. Um, but we are cosmically insignificant, and I don't really, doesn't really matter to me whether we are simulated by a computer. I know Elon Musk is a simulation. I know he's not real. That much I know.
And do you say that just because of his meme lordness or his ability to kind of execute on ambitious goals? Why do you say that?
He's just a robot. I have no proof. I have no credibility on that. I just don't think, I think he's an android.
Okay, you heard it here first, guys. A bold claim. All right, Scott. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. It was really great to chat with you, and I'll want to do it again down the road when,
So
as more and more things are changing every day in the media landscape. But thank you to you. I hope all the listeners go and check out the links in the show notes so you can follow Scott on Twitter and check out his articles on quartzqz.com. Yeah, Scott, thanks again. It's been a
thanks
blast.
so much,
Take
Chase. I
care.
appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.